Hello, everyone. Welcome to RIP's SISP SSP seminar. Today, we welcome Professor Michal Onderco. I hope I pronounced that well. Professor of International Relations at Erasmus University, Rotterdam. And also affiliate at Peace Research Center, Prague. She studies international security with focus on nuclear politics and on domestic politics of foreign policy. His recent book is Networked Non-Proliferation, and he also published Iran's Nuclear Program and the Global South, as well as papers which appeared in International Studies Quarterly, European Union Politics, Journal of Common Market Studies, and so on. In 2018 to 19, he was a junior faculty fellow at Stanford University's Center for International Security and Cooperation. So he's currently staying for about a month in Japan at Waseda University, I understand. But since we all share the interest in this extension of NPT in 1995, it's a pleasure to welcome you today, Michal, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, Professor Ivama, for the invitation. I have to get used to the fact that I see here myself, so it's a little bit distracting. It's a great pleasure to be here today and to be able to talk about my book. As Professor Ivama mentioned, this lecture builds on the book Networked Non-Proliferation, which I published with Stanford University Press in 2021. And that book was the pinnacle of a research that took me about 60 years, and partially it took forever because I relied on a number of freedom of access to freedom of information access requests, and these requests always take a lot of time. The main puzzle that I started with in this book was the idea of how come NPT was extended indefinitely if a majority of countries was not actually in favor of the extension. Can I somehow put my slides on? So, sure. Okay. There we go. Perfect. Thank you very much. So, how come the treaty was extended if a majority of countries didn't want it? And this is really surprising because if you look at how, for example, NPT works by consensus, and the dominant narrative throughout 1990s was that NPT is going to be extended for a short period of time. And this narrative emerged because over and over again, diplomats, experts, analysts, intelligence officers would say that there is a very small group of countries that are interested in indefinite extension of the treaty, and that majority of the countries are only interested in a short-term limited extension of the treaty. However, at the end, the treaty was extended indefinitely. You can see this moment here on a photo that was done by a Dutch diplomat using a camera that he purchased as a gift in New York during that visit. So it's not a particularly good quality, but this is the only picture that exists of the moment when the hammer went down and the treaty was extended indefinitely. What is interesting is that this treaty was extended indefinitely and was extended without the vote. And this is important because the NPT does not actually have provisions for a vote, so there couldn't even be a vote taken. So throughout this presentation, I hope to explain to you that the extension of the NPT had a lot to do with the fact that the indefinite extension of the treaty had one powerful champion, that was the United States, but that the United States didn't push it through, force it through by brute force, but by teaming up with countries that had very good connections in their region, by sort of rallying the support in the region by teaming up with the right countries. And so in a way, they leverage the power of their social network. For those of you who are new to the world of the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty is the most widely subscribed to multilateral security treaty. At this moment, only 5 countries in the world are not party to the treaty. It was negotiated in the United Nations throughout the 1960s, started with, in a small group called the 10 Nations Disarmament Committee, expanded in 1962 into 18 Nations Disarmament Committee, and the large part of the treaty was sort of agreed between the United States and Soviet Union in the second half of the 1960s, then submitted to the 18 Nations Disarmament Committee that adopted the treaty with very small changes. And the treaty was open for signature in 1968 and entered into force in 1970. Importantly, the treaty was initially signed for a period of 25 years. And this period of 25 years is important because it was a sort of give and take between what especially the Soviets wanted. The Soviets wanted a treaty that would be forever, and there would be no way for states to get out of it. And on the other hand, there were countries from the global south, but also importantly, European allies of the United States, who actually wanted a treaty of a short period of time that would be easy to get out of for states. Because there was a lot of concern about how this treaty is actually going to work out, and what are going to be the unintended consequences for technology sharing, but also for political integration in Europe. There was a lot of unknowns at that time. And so there was a compromise found of signing the treaty for a period of 25 years, with the idea that after the period of 25 years, there will be an extension conference. And I can talk more about why that period of 25 years was chosen, but I'll leave that for the Q&A. One of the provisions of the treaty says that there should be a review conference. And again, the review conferences have been put into the treaty as a way to sort of assure that states that the treaty sort of continues to fulfill its purpose. The review conferences take place every 5 years, and the first one took place in 1975, and it was a conference where it was the first and the only conference that concluded that the treaty was in good shape and all countries are in full compliance with its provisions. It was an interesting conference because in that conference, the East and the West, so the Soviet satellites and the Western countries agreed that actually disarmament obligations under the treaty have been fulfilled because SALT I negotiations were just completed at that time. And they sort of argued that instead of disarmament, the treaty should focus more on non-proliferation. However, the countries from the global south, united in the non-aligned movement, rejected the idea of universal safeguards. And there started to be already a discussion about comprehensive test-ban treaty. In other words, a lot of discussions that are with us up until today have actually been started already in 1975. The next review conference in 1980 is very similar, but what is new in that conference is again this emergence of the nuclear suppliers group. The nuclear suppliers group emerged after Indian peaceful nuclear explosion, with the concern that India, or with the concern that the supply of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes actually can lead to military spread of or the spread of nuclear energy, or the use of nuclear energy for military purposes. And so there was this growing concern that actually the technology that is supplied for peaceful purposes can end up fueling nuclear proliferation. And so the powerful industrial countries from the West and from the East that had the power to supply nuclear energy teamed up in nuclear suppliers group with the goal of restricting exports of nuclear technology to countries that didn't have it yet. This, of course, fueled a lot of resentment because there was a feeling that this is some sort of a stitch up against especially developing countries. The review conference in 1985 was again contentious because it was it gave a lot of attention to the nuclear weapons programs of Israel and South Africa, and it brought about a very interesting institutional innovation, which is the development of a body called the Friends of President. The previous review conferences had this idea that all the deliberations took place in the plenary. So if you had 100 countries in the plenary, then you did deliberations with 100 countries, which had a lot of input legitimacy, but the discussions were really long. And so there was a much less output legitimacy because not much was being done. And the president of the 1985 NPT Review Conference, Mohammed Shakir, came up with this idea that instead of working with the whole plenary, he's going to work only with a selected number of countries who are going to represent certain regions. And he's going to basically agree on the final documents with these countries, with the idea that if these countries agree with this, with the outcome document, then everybody else would be on board. And this is important because the Friends of President is an innovation which has survived up until today. All the NPT review conferences since then up until today are taking place in the same way. The last review conference before the indefinite extension took place in 1990. And the thing that is really important about the 1990 conference is that it was a failed conference. It was a failed conference because the countries from the global south, especially led by Mexico, wanted stronger view towards comprehensive test ban, and demanded negative security assurances, which was something that the nuclear weapon states were not particularly willing to extend. So going into the indefinite extension, there was this feeling that there was only one country that was really very strongly, or there was one country that had really strong interest in indefinite extension of the NPT, and that was the United States, because everyone else had some sort of a qualms with the treaty. Already under George Bush the father, and later under Clinton, the diplomatic process started in the United States in negotiating and preparing for the indefinite extension. And at that time, it was mainly a bureaucratic process that was led out of the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, ACDA, something that doesn't the rudimentary and routine diplomatic work. So attendance of international conferences, meeting with partners abroad, doing a lot of negotiations. And early on, ACDA realized that it would be a really good idea if the United States teamed up with a number of countries. And one of the first and most natural allies in this were the European countries. And I'm going to talk about that in a little while. Within the domestic system, what really played into the hands of, I don't know what's happening. Shall I reshare my screen?
No, 触っちゃっただけじゃない?
So there was a lot of concern that the United States would. Clinton administration outlined its views on the NPT extension in a document which is called PDD 13, Presidential Decision Directive 13, which, by the way, up until today is still classified. But Clinton afterwards talked about a lot of the ideas in his first speech to the United Nations. And in this first speech to the United Nations, Clinton says that the US is going to prioritize multilateral efforts to address nuclear proliferation and nuclear disarmament. And so there is this idea that multilateralism really matters in this area. And so the priority becomes to get NPT extended indefinitely. However, there is already at that time concern within the US government that ACDA might give away too much. In other words, that it's going to make concessions that are not necessarily in line with interests of all other parts of the American establishment, and that the concessions are going to be too big or more than necessary. And so in 1994, there is a decision adopted in the National Security Council where the task of extending NPT is no longer only the job of ACDA, so the Arms Control Disarmament Agency, but it becomes the so-called whole of government effort. And so every single part of the US government in all of its interactions with foreign partners is going to put this on the agenda. The formal head of the effort becomes the Deputy Director and General Counsel of ACDA, Ambassador Thomas Graham, whom you see here in the photo. But he works together with parts of National Security Council, Department of Defense, and White House. The year 1995, which is when the NPT Review Conference starts, with a memo which National Security Advisor Anthony Lake writes to President Clinton, where he says, this year we have no higher national security priority than unconditional extension of the NPT. In other words, this is a year where there was a lot of things happening in Europe. So there was a war in Yugoslavia going on. The Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty was sort of was being implemented. There was negotiation on the Chemical Weapons Convention, and National Security Advisor to the US President says, we have no higher priority than getting this treaty extended. Now, this also means that the White House with Clinton also becomes really focused on this goal. There is an elaborate process developed where Clinton was going to go and give speeches on the importance of multilateral approaches to non-proliferation. And it also becomes something that matters for Clinton administration in its domestic messaging to the public, that Clinton is the one who keeps Americans safe by keeping nuclear weapons away from the countries that shouldn't be having them. However, the Americans didn't have it very easy, and they didn't have it very easy because there were three basic competing proposals. The two proposals were the so-called rolling extension, and the rolling extension basically means that there would be successive period of extensions for a certain period of time, and these extensions would basically, there was a distinction between the so-called red light rolling extension or green light rolling extension. The red light rolling extension basically said there would be automatic extensions of the treaty unless a majority of states would vote against such an extension. And the key point, so this idea of red light rolling extension is something that has been developed within the domestic bureaucratic process of South Africa. So South African diplomats have been working on this idea basically throughout the whole review process since signing the treaty up until very shortly before the extension conference. And this was their preferred course of action. I'm going to talk about that in a little while. And they basically say, well, so this rollover is going to assure that we keep the feet of the, this was a proposal not championed by South Africa, but championed by a number of non-aligned countries. And their basic idea is we want to have a mechanism to keep the feet of the nuclear weapon states to the fire, to be able to push for nuclear disarmament. Their idea is that the length of this period is very crucial, and there were different proposals for how long this period should be. When it appeared at the conference, the period proposed was 25 years. The green light rolling extension is very similar, with the only difference being that in order to get from one period to another, you need to have a majority vote. So in other words, you need to have a majority of countries being in favor. This was the proposal that was put forward by South Africa. And their logic was, if you want to make a distinction between indefinite extension and sort of a long succession of time-bound extension, you need to have some sort of a mechanism to get from one period to another, and that must be an affirmative vote. And so they developed this idea within the domestic progress. There is also a legal opinion that is being developed, and they quietly start shopping it around at the end of 1994, early 1995, with the goal that this should at some point become the official policy of South Africa. It never becomes the official policy. I'm going to talk about that in a little while. And last but not least, there is an idea of conditional indefinite extension. There was a proposal was developed by Mexico, which basically says there should be indefinite extension, but it should be with conditions attached. And this is a proposal that has a lot of legal uncertainties, and it was not particularly clear what would happen if these conditions would not be extended. However, there were three credible alternatives to indefinite extension. And so for the United States to actually get its preferred idea of indefinite extension it had to come up with some sort of an idea. And my argument is that for the US to be able to do that, it needed to leverage the power of its networks. Because even if you are a really powerful hegemon, like the United States was in the early 1990s, you cannot coerce everyone, right? So you need some sort of idea of a consent. And states very often leverage their connections for policy outcomes in general. So this is the bread and butter of diplomats. If you want to get something done, you try to get others to agree with it, or at least not oppose it. You try to build networks and coalitions. And so for the thing that helped the United States is that it had a lot of platforms, and it had very varied relationships with different actors. I'm going to talk about the three that, in my view, mattered the most: the relationship that the US had with Europe, the relationship that it had with South Africa, and the relationship that it had with Egypt. And with all of them, it was a different type of relationship that it had. What is also important is that a lot of these relationships are fungible. So, for example, the relationship that US had to Europe was mainly political, but the leverage that the Europeans used to actually get others to agree with the indefinite extension was very strongly economical. So this is where you can see the fungibility of the relationship. The relationship that the US had with Egypt was based on the military alliance. However, the leverage that Egypt used in its region was mainly political, and other way around. And so for the US, it was really key that it was able to leverage not only its own networks, but also its networks. In other words, it was very, very well embedded in the system. It had a lot of connections, and it was able to leverage not only its own connections, but also the connections of its own connections. And this is what made the United States different from others. As I mentioned, the first country that really mattered, or the first actor that really mattered, were the Europeans. And the relationship that, and when I talk about Europeans, I mean mainly the Western European and other groups at the United Nations, because the NPT, like anything related to UN, is run by the regional groups. And so the US was linked to Western European countries through the WEOG group. The relationship that really matters there is that there is an agreement very early on in the WEOG group that indefinite extension is desirable, and there is no discussion about it. So Europeans want it, Americans want it. However, the Americans have very limited means to reach out to, for example, countries in Central Asia or in Eastern Europe. But this is where Europeans have a lot of connections. Why? Because a lot of these countries wanted to build their relationship with the EU. They wanted to have a trading relationship. Some of them wanted to become members of the EU. And so the EU was able to leverage this pressure and to sort of push it on these countries. However, Europeans were also not particularly comfortable with the sort of naked exercise of power that the United States was doing. Especially in the run-up to the conference, the United States started to send demarches left and right to all the countries, including to many of the allies, saying, we are not happy with the way how you show your commitment to indefinite extension. We really need stronger commitment from your end. And this is something that the Europeans didn't quite like. And what you see here in the photo, and I'm going to minimize this so you can, those of you who read German, this is a note from political director of German Foreign Ministry, who sort of gets a memo, and then on the bottom he says, we don't agree with the pressure that the United States have been exercising in recent time. So the Europeans are very happy to team up. They're very happy to leverage their networks, but they're not passive acceptors of everything that comes from Washington. They sort of they have their own ideas, especially when it comes to how strong to push on some countries when it comes to trying to persuade them for the indefinite extension. The really interesting case is the case of South Africa. And South Africa is a country that had a lot of normative power and a lot of political capital. It recently came out of apartheid. It recently announced that it gave up its nuclear weapon. There was a lot of followers within NAM. There was a lot of countries in Africa and broadly within the non-aligned movement who sort of want to follow what South Africa has to say. And so very early on, the United States tries to do a lot of outreach to South Africa. Thomas Graham, whom you saw earlier, travels to the United States, to South Africa, and tries to get a commitment from South Africa that it would be in favor of the indefinite extension. Now, as I told you a few minutes ago, at that time, South Africa actually wants to develop this alternative view of this rolling extension. But South African diplomats tell American diplomats repeatedly that their domestic political deliberation hasn't run its course, and so they cannot commit to any particular solution at the time, which is a sort of very funny ploy, because on one hand, they sort of develop this domestic plan for this green light rolling extension, but outside, especially when it comes to discussions with the Americans, they talk very clearly about, well, we haven't made our decision yet. There is a famous letter that was sent by Bill Clinton to President Mandela in February 1995, in which Clinton basically talks about the fact that the support from South Africa would be really important for the extension of the NPT. What really becomes important is the friendship that Thabo Mbeki and Al Gore developed. Thabo Mbeki at that time is executive vice president of South Africa. Al Gore is vice president of the United States. And they meet in spring 1995 when Mbeki travels for the first time to the United States to start the US-South Africa Bilateral Commission. And he was expecting a lot of focus on economics, and he also came with the economic agenda to Washington. And he comes there, and he's basically ambushed by this American pressure to support indefinite extension. He goes to White House. He has a meeting in the Oval Office with Bill Clinton. Clinton tells him, indefinite extension of the NPT is my #1 priority, and I need your help. And so Mbeki sort of thinks about this whole thing, and he, not being particularly well briefed by his staff before, he also thinks that there is a bigger fish to fry for South Africa than the NPT. In other words, for Mbeki, this is a question about what kind of relationships do we want to have with the United States. And so after he comes back from Washington, he exchanges a number of letters with Gore when they keep exchanging ideas. And then on the 1st of April 1995, so about less than 2 weeks before the start of the conference, there is a big policy meeting in South Africa where different policy preferences are being discussed. The foreign ministry comes up with its plan to support the green light rolling extension that they have been developing. And Mbeki says, no, we're going to support indefinite extension because this is the best thing for our future foreign policy. And so the South Africans sort of then turn it around and they start supporting indefinite extension. And with that, they are also able to bring on board not only a number of African countries, but they also are able to break the consensus within the non-aligned movement against indefinite extension, and to basically make sure that everybody on board is a free agent, and so more countries support indefinite extension. The third partner that that United States partners with is Egypt, and here you see on the photo of Hosni Mubarak, who traveled to Washington shortly before the NPT review conference to meet President Clinton and talk about different issues. But one of the issues that the United States really cared about is the Egyptian opposition to indefinite extension. And for Egypt, this was really a prominent issue because for Egypt, its concern about Israel's nuclear weapon program was one of the main issues of its foreign policy. Because Egypt had a peace treaty with Israel, it was in a slightly different position than many other Middle Eastern countries. But it really made a big effort to prevent the extension of the NPT unless Israel joined the treaty. And so because it had these extensive bilateral negotiations with the US, it was also able to signal its resolve. And so what the United States did is during the conference, it negotiated separately with the Egypt, so outside of the eyes of the rest of the conference, about under what conditions would Egypt not threaten to derail the indefinite extension. Egyptians very early on realized that they're not going to stop the indefinite extension. In the book, I recall an interview where I did with Amr Moussa, who was at that time Egyptian foreign minister. And Amr Moussa basically said he was sitting in the UN General Assembly, he was listening to South African foreign minister, and so South African foreign minister says, we're going to support indefinite extension. And Amr Moussa says, well, that was the moment when I thought, khalas, they're going to get it done, because there was no way we could oppose this. But they knew that they had a price to be exacted. And the price that they exacted for not calling a vote was the Middle Eastern weapons of mass destruction free zone. So the fact that there was a zone, there was a resolution that there would be a discussion about the zone on the Middle East weapons of mass destruction. And this was a sort of a resolution that was negotiated between the United States and Egypt. It was tabled by the three depositories, so by Russia, UK, and US, without any of these three countries actually knowing what's in the resolution. So this is really interesting. And all of them supporting the resolution, and this resolution sort of turning a niche regional issue into a matter that matters for the whole NPT. So to wrap up, at the end, we have an extension of the treaty with the three decisions. The three decisions basically have the decision on the strengthened review process. So that's often seen as the price of the extension, especially after the extension in early years after extension, the strengthened review process was really seen as the price of extension. So the fact that we have now, for example, the preparatory committees that are pretty long, there are repeated review conferences, all of that is a part of the strengthened review process. Decision 2 is the principles and objectives. And the principles and objectives is a document that comes primarily from South African internal deliberations. And it was mainly seen not as a yardstick, but as a lodestar. In other words, something that basically all countries should aspire to in the future. And it's a document that actually doesn't talk a lot about nuclear disarmament. It talks about a lot of other things, but there are only 2 very short paragraphs that talk about nuclear disarmament in that part. And the third document, the third decision is a simple one-line extension. So it's basically the conference decides that the treaty is extended indefinitely. In the record, all 3 decisions are listed separately, so that it's absolutely clear that there is no connection between them. They are independent from one another. They're not conditional on one another. This was clarified in the record of the conference upon the intervention of the German ambassador, who was asked to do that by the United States. So it's a really clear thing. Also, separately from these 3 decisions, there was a resolution on the Middle East that was adopted, and it was also seen as not being a part of the extension package, but as being a price for not voting on it. And so this is also the reason why it's adopted separately. The fact that the treaty was extended indefinitely without the vote, and with this really interesting formula that there is a consensus that a majority exists in favor of the extension, is a result of the US being able to leverage these individual networks and to be able to leverage the networks of its networks. And so I hope that this book also is an interesting piece of work on how even big countries need cooperation of other countries, and how smaller countries can actually put its stamp on big issues of global importance like the non-proliferation order. I thank you for your attention. I think I ran a little bit over time, and I'll be looking forward to hearing comments from the discussant.
Right. Thank you so much for that. Now we have participants here in real and also online. Those of you who are online and wish to send comments or questions, please do so via Q&A box. I don't think we have a chat column today somehow, so please send them in per Q&A box. Write them in and send them in, and I'll read them out. Otherwise, we have several participants here also in the room. Now, first of all, I would like to ask Sayaka Shingu. It's my pleasure to welcome Ms. Shingu here, Assistant Director at Non-Proliferation, Science and Nuclear Energy Division, Disarmament, Non-Proliferation, and Science Department of Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan. And she's also a fellow of the Mansfield Next Generation of US-Japan Nuclear Policy Experts. So, Sayako-san, you have the floor.
Thank you, Yuama-sensei, for a kind introduction. And also thank you, Michael, for a comprehensive explanation. Before starting my comments, I need to, and I would like to clarify that the views and contents that I will express here during today's comments are purely of my own and do not represent any institute or organization that I belong to. Okay, first, congratulations, Michael, for publishing this excellent book on network non-proliferation. I found that network non-proliferation is very interesting, and I believe it has contributed a lot to the NPT researches from the following 3 points. First, focusing on the 1995 Extension Conference itself, which remained room for further research. UNIDIL and SIPRI used to conduct a comprehensive memoir of President Danapala, which I read as well. Yet it is quite rare, as Michael did, to tackle the question why the NPT member states were able to agree on the extension in 1995. So that's number one. And second, revealing the perspectives of EU, which has previously not been researched so much. I myself also participated in a lot of EU conferences and especially EU consortium on disarmament and non-proliferation, and always wonder how to describe the role of EU because they have contributed but not has been so described. With the analysis of the US network power, Michael found that US cooperation with EU paved the way to gain support for an indefinite extension. So that's one of the biggest contributions. And third, casting a light on the perspectives of non-countries, such as South Africa and Egypt. Dr. William Potter and Dr. Gokler Mukhanova at CNS compiled a comprehensive review on NAM perspectives and based upon the NPT discussions, but analyzing individual states' role in the 1995 indefinite extension and what were obstacles and how they were overcome. These points have not been fully researched before. Therefore, Michael's analysis provided a historical foundation for the ongoing NPT review cycle discussion. All of these points are uniquely analyzed based on the US network power analysis method. And as an official also who worked also, for strengthening and maintaining NPT review cycle, I enjoyed learning from this history and understanding the historical discussions of the indefinite extension is crucial to understand the perspectives of NAM and the Middle East states, the sprout of their frustration for the ongoing situations, as well as reminds us of the importance of multilateralism. Having said so, while reading, I also noticed that the following points have not been mentioned so much, and I'm also eager to know more. So I would like to leave the following 5 questions to Michael. First, how do you define the terminology Global South and NAM? I think the NPT review cycle tends to use NAM more than Global South. So how different are they in your argument? Second, why did you select EU, South Africa, and Egypt and not other states as a case study? One chapter explained why you decided to focus on the indefinite extension and the other on the US network power analysis method. However, I was not able to be sure well why you decided to focus on these three actors, not other states, such as, for example, new actors, China or France at that time, or could it be Mexico, another influential actor at that time. It would be highly appreciated if you could elaborate more on it. Third, do you have any analysis on the decision on strengthening the NPT review process? You analyzed that indefinite extension was possible thanks to the US-EU cooperation. The decision on the principle and objective was generated thanks to the US and South Africa cooperation. And the resolution on the Middle East was generated, followed by the US-Egypt consultations. Then what about strengthening the NPT review process, which is one of the relevant, important topics for the next NPT review cycle. So I would like to hear your take. Fourth, do you think the US network power was the main decisive factor to achieve the indefinite extension? Given the amicable atmosphere of the international community after the end of Cold War, such international trend could have been another contributing factor for the NPT member states to agree on the indefinite extension. So what's your take on this regard? Finally, you concluded that US should use its own network power for the ongoing NPT review cycle discussion as well. However, do you think that the United States still has the same power as it used to do? Russia and China have increased its influences to the NAM countries. I believe the situation might be more polarized compared to the past dominant network power by the United States. So what's your analysis in this regard? So I will stop here, then look forward to hearing Michael's views and learning much more from you.
Thank you. Shall I answer?
Yes,
Yes.
please.
Okay. Thank you very much. So shall I do something about what's on the screen?
Just press the blue.
The blue one. Okay. Good.
So,
Good. Perfect. Thank you very much. So first of all, thank you very much, Seika, for the fantastic questions and for reading my book. So when it comes to the vocabulary about NAM and in the Global South, I talk about NAM if I talk about the organization, and I talk about Global South if I talk about the countries that sort of are not part of the former Soviet bloc or the Western bloc. And so I try to sort of separate between what are the trends among these countries and what are the policies that are adopted by this institutional framework. There is, of course, often a big overlap, but in the Global South, you actually have also other countries. So, for example, in the book, I mentioned very briefly the engagement that many of the countries had, for example, with Israel or with India and Pakistan. And those are not countries that are part of the NPT. They are, well, Israel is not really a Global South country, but India and Pakistan are. And so this is also how I try to distinguish between the two. When it comes to the second question about why EU, Egypt, and South Africa and not others, I have described these because in the course of the research, I came to believe that those were the three really crucial relationships. And I have been thinking about others, particularly about the role of China, the role of Russia, and I mean, you now mentioned Mexico. I was also thinking about role of Indonesia. In the non-aligned movement and in the Global South, and I have came to conclusion that Russia and China were not so particularly important. Russia, for the reasons that in 1995 it was basically a country that in the run-up to the writing of this book, I did an interview with a number of Russian diplomats, and one of them explained to me that Russia in 1995 had no allies, had no friends, had no countries that it could influence, right? So even the countries in its own Eastern European group wouldn't listen to Russia. Even the countries in Central Asia wouldn't listen to Russia. And so Russian diplomatic leverage was very limited. China actually was not committed to indefinite extension at the time. It became committed only at the conference itself. So that was the reason why China was not a particularly important and helpful player. And when it comes to countries like Mexico and Indonesia, they were not working for indefinite extension. They had some other plans. And so also for the United States, it was not particularly important to, I mean, of course, they tried to engage them. And well, the United States sort of tried to engage Mexico in different ways and ended up sort of using very brute, coercive manner to make sure that Mexico didn't wreck the conference. But Mexico also did not really try to build a coalition around its proposal for conditional extension of the NPT. So the third question about the strengthening of the review process and where it came from, it's a really interesting question because there is very little paper trail on how that document came about. If you look at, for example, principles and objectives, there is a lot of paper trail where there is a proposal that comes up from South Africa. There is a counter proposal developed in the WEO group. There is a negotiation. I think there is like 17 different versions of the document. For strengthening the review process, there is very little of that discussion. Also in the interviews that I have done, and I also organized a critical oral history conference where I talked to where I invited a number of diplomats, and they all told me that this was not a contentious issue. They didn't find this to be in any way problematic or contentious. So I didn't discuss it to great length in the book because people at the time did not really pay attention to it a lot. When it was adopted, then it became a focus of a lot of experts because they said, oh, well, you actually adopted this animal, but what does it actually mean? How do we make it work? But that happened only after 1995. The question about this sort of international atmosphere is a very important one. And I think it was an important contributing factor that made a lot of countries think that actually things are going in the right direction. But even then, there was a number of countries who didn't want to have the NPT extended indefinitely, precisely because they thought that things are going in the right direction. So we need to speed things up. We need to sort of push for more disarmament. And those voices were especially heard in the Global South. And so I think this conducive environment was useful. And I talk about this in the book. Joe Pilat called 1990s the golden age of arms control, that this was really the high point of arms control. But there was still, even in this golden era, there was still a majority of countries that didn't want to have the treaty extended. So I think that also makes it very important to explain. The last question about the US network power today is actually a really important one. And there was something that I spent a lot of time thinking. And I think, so what I argue in the book is basically that this network power and social power that states have tends to be more sticky than material power. And so that it tends to sort of stay for a longer period of time. And so states can also use it fungibly with other forms of power. And so if you are a former, or if you're a great power, you can also still make it, you can use it even if you are no longer the predominant global power, like the United States is no longer the preponderant power in the world. I do think that if the United States paid attention to the NPT and gave it the diplomatic prestige that it had in 1995, it could get more preferences out, and it could get actually more. It could get more following. You know, this was a period of time when the U.S. president would regularly talk about NPT review conferences in the Oval Office with his foreign counterparts, and this doesn't happen today. maybe the Secretary of State talks about it, but not the president. Limited goal for the US foreign policy to promote NPT. Like, there are some people, of course, the US has an ambassador for the NPT, and that ambassador travels the world, but the whole power of the US diplomacy is not behind it. So that might be also a reason why what we see today is no longer such a massive instrumentation of the US network power. That would be my answer, but I agree it's a difficult question.